And when you consider those options, how diverse was the range of advice you were getting on them? Were you getting advice fed into you from people with a real knowledge of the Middle East and Iraq? And were you having people challenging the paper and pointing out that some of the possible downsides if you went this way or that way?
The one thing I've found throughout this whole matter, from a very early stage, is that I was never short of people challenging me on it.
So can you identify who they were?
Well, there were people within the cabinet, obviously. For example, Robin Cook, and from time to time Claire Short.
But they weren't at the Chequers meeting?
No, they weren't, but we would discuss this. We discussed, obviously, prior to the invasion in Iraq, I think there were no fewer than 24 different cabinet meetings. This was a topic that was right through the mainstream.
But you didn't discuss
UK
the
politics.
options paper in Cabinet?
We didn't discuss the options paper specifically in Cabinet, but we certainly
didn't
discussed...
It didn't even go to all the Cabinet. I mean, Claire Short didn't get a paper. She complained that she hadn't got it in the first place.
Yes, but the discussion that we had in Cabinet was a substantive discussion. We had it again and again and again, and the options were very simple. You know, the options were a sanctions framework that was effective, alternatively, the UN inspectors doing the job, alternatively, you have to remove Saddam. Those were the options.
And what were the downside arguments being put to you about removing Saddam?
Well, the downside arguments, and this was partly from, for example, I was reading telegrams coming in from ambassadors abroad and so on. The downside arguments were obviously going to be that not merely is military action always something that you should consider only as a last resort, but there were issues to do with relationships in the Muslim world, there were issues to do with what the effect would be in the Arab world and so on. But what you find in these situations is that you will get a range of different views. Some people were saying, you must not on no account contemplate military action. Other people were saying, it's time you acted. And so, for example, I think it was in mid-2002, the Conservative Party put out a paper saying, this is why Saddam is a threat and we have to act. Other people were saying, I think the Liberal Democrats were saying, he may be a threat, but you should rule out military action. So it's not as if we weren't getting the full range of views. We got the full range of views from the very beginning. The trouble was, we had to take a decision. And my decision was that we could not afford to have this situation go on. How we then dealt with it, however, was an open question.
Were the views being put to you, did they include people warning you that what happened after you toppled Saddam Hussein, if one did end up doing that, would raise some difficult questions and risks of sectarian strife within Iraq? How much was that spelt out in the advice from that time?
Most of the advice was a worry about a humanitarian catastrophe if Saddam was removed. There was advice, and I actually called for papers on this, I think a little bit later, on what the Sunni-Shia relationship would be, and that was obviously an issue. It was an issue we raised within our own deliberations with the Americans and elsewhere. And so all of these things were factors that we had to take into account. But the primary consideration for me was to send an absolutely powerful, clear, and unremitting message that after September the 11th, if you were a regime engaged in WMD, you had to stop.
Well, that brings me, I think, to the final points that I want to ask, because from the evidence that we've heard so far from now a large number of witnesses and from the documents we've read, it does begin to appear that by about March or April of 2002, you were strongly attracted to the idea of changing the regime in Iraq, and in a sense, in doing so, you were building on a philosophy of humanitarian intervention that you had first, I think, set out in a very public way in your Chicago speech of April 1999. And you, in April, of course, of 2002, after your meeting with President Bush, returned to it in your speech at the George Bush Presidential Library at College Station, when you said, talking in general of regime change, not specifically in this paragraph about Iraq, if necessary, the action should be military, and again, if necessary and justified, it should involve regime change. I have been involved as British Prime Minister in 3 conflicts involving regime change: Milosevic, the Taliban, and Sierra Leone. Had you reached the point where you regarded, within this philosophy, removing Saddam's regime, and I don't think anybody was ever in any doubt about the evilness of Saddam's regime, as a valid objective for the government's policy?
No, the absolutely key issue was the WMD issue. But I think it's just worth it at this point, and then I'll come specifically to the Texas speech and deal with this notion that somehow in Crawford I shifted our position.
Well, we'll talk about Crawford separately. I'm sticking on the strategy now.
Right, sorry, I thought you were referring to the
I was referring to the
presidential.
speech. I'm referring to the specifically...
But wasn't that the day after the Crawford meeting?
It was the day after the Crawford meeting, and it's in the context of your philosophy of regime change.
Okay. Let me make it quite clear. In the Chicago speech in 1999, what I was doing was setting out very clearly what I thought the consequences were of an interdependent world. And what I was really saying was this, that whereas in the past people might have thought that a security problem in one part of the world can be divorced from its impact on another part, in the world that was developing, we were no longer able to do that. Not financially, not in terms of security, not in terms actually of the cultural issues. In other words, as a result of an interdependent world, it then became in our self-interest, not as part simply of some moral cause, but in our self-interest to regard ourselves as affected by what was happening in a different part of the world. I actually have the Chicago speech here if you want me to refer to it.
I have it too, and I have referred to it, and